After years of pressure, with Neil Adams being one of the foremost pressurers, finally in 1981, DC Comics offered a royalties, to its creators. Now, before, this was always, let me tell you how things worked. You kind of probably have gathered this. But essentially, working for Marvel, DC, or any of those companies that we've talked about up to now, what you were doing, as Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster learned, was work for hire. And what that essentially would mean is that if you created a character, let's say, and it was in the pages of a Marvel or DC comic book, they owned it. You didn't own it. You got paid one time the page rate. And I'm not sure what the page rates were in the early 1980s. But finally, there's a royalties offer, giving some stake in the success of the books beyond just how high a page rate that you can command. So the deal was, after an issue of a comic book passes 100,000 copies, after that, then the royalties would start kicking in. 4%, which were to be shared by the writer and the artist, the creative team. Now, Marvel pretty much had to follow suit, or else everyone would have gone to DC, right? So Marvel followed suit. Here's the deal, though. DC, when they laid this deal out, you got to get 100,000 copies. If you are working on a book and that book sells 98,000 copies, you don't get any royalties at all. If it sells 101,000 copies, then you get royalties, but not on the first 100,000 copies. So you just get royalties on that 1,000 extra. Okay. Now, only 3 titles at DC were selling more than 100,000 copies a month. Teen Titans, which was there at the very top, and Warlord, which was that sword and sorcery title that was written and illustrated by Mike Grell, and Superman was selling that well. So Batman and Detective Comics and the Justice League, none of those were cracking 100,000. Meanwhile, over at Marvel, every single thing they had sold more than 100,000 copies per month. Their bestseller was Uncanny X-Men in 1982, which was averaging about 300,000 copies or more. And by the way, the Uncanny X-Men, that was the first year that they were the number one seller, surpassing Spider-Man for Marvel. And they would do that 17 years in a row until I think 1998, 99. Anyway, so X-Men is number one. Number two in 1982 was Daredevil, Frank Miller's Daredevil, which was, I'm not sure the exact numbers, around 250,000. Amazing Spider-Man was doing around that. Fantastic Four came in probably next because they had become very popular again because John Byrne from the X-Men had taken over the Fantastic Four as both writer, penciler, and inker. And the Avengers always cracked 200,000 at that time and going forward for the next 20 years. So what that means, this 4,000, let's take a look at, let's say, for example, you're on the Avengers and it sells 200,000 copies. First 100,000, you don't get anything. But then you get 4% of what comes after that. Now, I'm not sure if that's 4% gross or net. I'm thinking it would have to be gross, because if it were net, they could, basically whittle it down to nothing. So let's say it's gross. If your book sells 200,000 copies, then essentially that is an extra $3,000 to split. So if you're John Byrne and that book is Fantastic Four, let's say, and you're both the writer and the artist, then you'd get basically all of that. So that's an extra $3,000 a month income. So that's an extra what? $36,000 a year on top of the page rates. And John Byrne and Frank Miller probably had the highest page rates. So $36,000. The average wage in 1982 was around $15,000. Okay, the average wage in 2020 is $52,000. So getting an extra $3,000 a month in 1982, $36,000 a year, would be equal to something like $120,000, $130,000 extra that you would be getting today. So if you were part of that, if you were one of those elite artists, then you could actually be making some pretty good money. Most artists were not. But if you were an artist at Marvel, with the way that their books were selling compared to DC, you were going to be getting something extra at least. Well, let's talk a bit about the concept of the superstar comic book artist, which was something that, at least in the way we're talking about it now, didn't come about until the late 60s, early 70s. Now, in the earlier periods, in the Golden Age, you could say, for example, Bob Kane was a bit of a superstar in his day because he was able to leverage in his initial deal with Detective Comics to get his name on the splash page of every single comic book that starred Batman, whether he had anything directly to do with it or not. Will Eisner was kind of a superstar of his day because of the enormous influence that he wielded, but also largely because of the extraordinary popularity of the Spirit in newspapers, which a lot more people read newspapers even than comic books. So he had name recognition. Both those guys had name recognition in a time when almost no one literally had name recognition because they didn't even get their name listed as part of the process. Now, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko in the early 60s co-created these extraordinarily popular characters in the Marvel Universe, and their names became attached to them because they were credited for their art, if not for their participation in the plot. So all these Marvel fans knew who they were, and they were revered. But it's not quite the same thing. I'm talking about artists who are just celebrities, even beyond the comic book world, who are celebrities and followed by, rabid fanboys and fangirls. And whenever they release something, there's extraordinary demand for it, and the resale value of anything they touch goes through the roof because they're so popular at that time. And this is something that really only started with Jim Steranko in 1968, 1969, and then sort of came to its full fruition in Neil Adams in 1970, 71, with his touch becoming gold. Now, some of the other people that we've talked about include, over at DC, Mike Grell, whose sword and sorcery book, The Warlord, was beautifully illustrated and made him a name figure. And, of course, George Perez, who had been doing a lot of good stuff throughout the 1970s and was regarded, highly regarded as a comics professional, but didn't become a celebrity until Teen Titans sort of riding the wave of the popularity of the X-Men, went through the roof. Speaking of the X-Men, John Byrne, who did not co-create most of those characters, those famous X-Men characters, but who became so closely associated with them and with their sort of their peak years. So early 80s, John Byrne, George Perez, John Byrne, and Frank Miller were the big names. Frank Miller because of his breakout artistic performance in Daredevil, which, no one would have even believed that Daredevil would be Marvel's best-selling book, even for a short time. Now, John Byrne and Frank Miller in the mid to late 80s are going to do some different things for other companies that are going to further cement their celebrity status. But this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. They commanded a much higher page rate than their contemporaries. Now, there were artists working in the business at that time, some of whom had been plugging away for years, that were liked by fans and who were highly regarded by their peers. People like John Buscema is a good example. But it was kind of a select group of people who were John Buscema's fans. He didn't have this kind of, this celebrity rush for him that these other guys got. And then Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, they came along too early. They came along too early before that sort of thing became a thing. But I tell you, since then, since around 1980, it has become the norm. You look at any time period, late 80s, late 90s, early 20 teens, whatever it is, you look at a time period and there's going to be 5 or 6 artists that are superstars, not just stars. And this is really when that was starting to gel. Now, at this time, there was no such thing as superstar writers. There might be writers whose work was recognized, but nobody was following along. Well, maybe some people were, but not many people were following along at comics conventions, for example, in the 1980s, trying to get writers to autograph a script for them. No, they were wanting artists' autographs on their work. Now we're going to step back for just a second and talk once more about graphic novels and the developing of graphic novels. There's one work that I didn't mention that was one of the several sort of precursors to the graphic novel, and that was a book called Black Mark by Gil Kane. Gil Kane with the script done by Archie Goodwin, although he wasn't credited, just like the 1968 Savage, the one with Lee Marvin's face on the front. Except this one was a post-apocalyptic fantasy sword and sorcery type story. It was released by Bantam Books as a regular-sized mass-market paperback, not as a magazine or a comic book or as a what's called a trade paperback. Just a regular-sized paperback. And it was not described as a comic novel or a graphic novel, but it was, well, as you can see, it's very text-heavy, but at the same time, the dialogue appears in word balloons. Well, the plan had been to release a series of these, 6, but the first one did not sell, and so Bantam dropped the whole thing and didn't continue. However, Kane and Goodwin had already had the next one finished and ready to go. It just wasn't published, and it kind of sat in limbo for several years until 1979. Now, this is the year after Will Eisner's contract with God came out and made a big splash and had described itself as a graphic novel, thereby presenting that term to the public at large. So this is in an issue of Marvel Preview, issue 17. Marvel Preview was one of Marvel's black and white magazines, in which they would have different things each month, like maybe a particular superhero or a horror story or whatever. And this one had in its entirety, the entire issue was the second Black Mark novel, the sequel to the first one, again by Gil Kane, and again with the text by Archie Goodwin, but not credited. So notice that on the cover it's described as an all-new graphic novel masterpiece. Now, this is how quickly Marvel got on board with the idea of the term graphic novel being used at all, and the fact that it's more than just a descriptor, that it carries an air of prestige that sort of is a heavier air of prestige than calling something a comic book, which isn't necessarily true, but it has that connotation. Well, within a couple of years after that, more graphic novels had come out, and the term was starting to be used more often. And Marvel decided that they would start regularly producing graphic novels, a line called the Marvel Graphic Novel line. That these were trade paperbacks, the same format in which you can buy most graphic novels today. And the first one that came out in 1982 was The Death of Captain Marvel, which we discussed when we talked about Captain Marvel, by Jim Starlin. So this is a big event, right? Because I was going to say a major superhero, a second string superhero, someone who had his own title for a long time anyway, was being killed off, and the bold decision not to have him die in battle or sacrifice his life for the universe, but get cancer, right? So this was heavily advertised and sold really, really well, and it was the first of many in this line throughout the 1980s. They were coming out with several a year eventually, including new graphic novel adventures of Conan the Barbarian, fantasy and science fiction originals, and also superhero stories in graphic novel form, which means they were not reprinted issues of the Avengers or the Amazing Spider-Man. It was all new, all original, including this one here on the left, Emperor Doom, which was a fascinating story in which Dr. Doom finally succeeds in conquering the world. And what would that actually look like? Also in 1982, Marvel decided to use the graphic novel format and their official graphic novel line to introduce the next generation of X-Men to be mutants, the New Mutants, which is like this is a group of teenagers that Professor X took under his wing, just like the original X-Men. And so they got their own title after this, but to get their origin, you had to buy the graphic novel. All right, well, now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some of the publishers that arose in the late 1970s and into the early to the mid 1980s. Independent publishers. They're not one of the big two, which the big two, I guess by this point, by the early 80s, Dell is gone, Harvey is gone, Charlton is gone. Basically, mainstream large comics publishers, you've essentially got Marvel, DC, and Archie. However, new publishers started to arise. Some of them would have several titles. Some of them might only have one or two titles. Some of them would last for a long time, some of them all the way up to the present, others not so much. So we're going to look through here at some of those and the things that they were offering. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because it could become overwhelming because there were a lot of them. So we're going to go through this next part kind of quick, probably. We'll start with Fantagraphics, that was established in Los Angeles in 1976 and which moved to Seattle in 1989. Now, they may have started in 1976, but they didn't start making comic books in 1976. They started making magazines about comic books. First, the Comics Journal, and then a little bit later on, Amazing Heroes, which, as you can see, had lots of cool interviews with various artists and writers. It wasn't until 1979 that they started doing their own comics. And in 1982, they picked up Love and Rockets by the Hernandez brothers that we talked about in detail earlier, and which was extremely successful for an independent comic, and which really brought them the attention that enabled them to expand their business. Another mid-'80s title they had was Dalgota. Now, in addition to that stuff, they also started picking up titles that had started in other independent comics. By the late 80s, they were doing that, and also releasing prestige format reprints of earlier graphic novels and the like. In fact, a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about, you will perhaps have noticed the Fantagraphics logo on. We really can't mention prestige reprints from an independent company from the 1980s without mentioning someone that we've already talked about, Kitchen Sink Press, which had started in 1970 as an underground comics publisher founded by Dennis Kitchen, underground comics artist. Dennis Kitchen is the guy, you will recall, who edited Marvel Comics' brief foray into underground comics and who drew Stan Lee as J. Jonah Jameson. Anyway, by the 1980s, they had begun reprinting every single comic strip appearance of the Spirit. They also, during that time, in the early 80s, they were the ones who were publishing the anthology comic Gay Comics that we talked about earlier. And I'm pretty sure they were the first American publishers of Alan Moore's From Hell. So this is not a new company. This is a company that has weathered the underground comics movement and the collapse thereof, and is now survived its way into the independent publishing of comics movement. They also did some new Spirit stuff as well as reprints. Here's another one that we've seen several times and several of the things we've talked about, Eclipse Comics, which got their start in 1977, and they really were in on the ground floor of this whole independent comics movement. Now, we talked about them just a few minutes ago in regard to Saber by Don McGregor and Paul Gulacy, which was the very first graphic novel to be released direct sales only. So that's as ground floor as you can get. And they followed that up with a couple of other Don McGregor graphic novels, two different Detectives Inc. novels, one penciled by Marshall Rogers and one by Gene Colan. This was a noir, hard-boiled crime detective story featuring two private detectives who are, they're partners. Later on, Eclipse made a regular ongoing comics series out of these characters by Don McGregor. Also from Eclipse Comics, I just mentioned Alan Moore. We'll be talking a lot more about him, a lot more. But Alan Moore, who is a British writer, and Alan Davis, a British artist, introduced their American superhero, Miracle Man, in Eclipse Comics. And Sabre, much like Detectives Inc., which had started as graphic novels, became a regular series from Eclipse. Steve Gerber came over to Eclipse also. He's the guy that created Howard the Duck and quit Marvel in, well, it was kind of acrimonious. It was a bad split up. It was centered around his efforts to try to get creator ownership, to claim creator ownership of Howard the Duck, which his argument was he had created that before he came to Marvel, but it hadn't been in print. So anyway, he lost. He lost that, and he lost the royalties to Howard the Duck. And so he creates a new duck, Destroyer Duck, which is more fitting for his mood at the time. Also, from Chuck Dixon and Timothy Truman, Airboy. Airboy, which was one of the popular Golden Age comics of the World War II era, is brought back. Chuck Dixon also, around that same time, was writing the adventures of Black Hawk over at DC Comics. And another Eclipse comic to mention is Coyote by Steve Englehart and Marshall Rogers, a Native American-centric title. Eclipse Comics in the 80s was headed up by Kat Ironwood. We talked about her when we were discussing important and influential women in the comics business. All right, here's another one, Pacific Comics, which had a short run that made up basically the early 80s, 81 to 84. Among other things that they put out, they got the rights to Michael Moorcock's fantasy novel character, Elric of Melniboné, who was really popular in the 1970s. It's kind of a much more highbrow Conan the Barbarian. It's more high fantasy than sword and sorcery. And so they had the comic adventures of him, and they got Jack Kirby when he made his return to comics. Remember when I said that he wasn't going to stay in animation for very long? He'd go back to the comics world, but not to Marvel or DC. He comes to Pacific and creates another bunch of brand new characters, Captain Victory and the Galactic Rangers, and Silver Star, the Next Breed. Also from Pacific Comics, you had Gru the Wanderer, which was created, written, and drawn by Sergio Aragonés, who was an artist from Spain originally, who had been working at Mad Magazine since the early 1960s and still was at this time. And I'm pretty sure it still was as of 2018 when they stopped making new material for Mad Magazine. So Gru the Wanderer was his take on his parody of Conan the Barbarian. Now, later on, this got picked up by Marvel Comics, where it also ran for a long time. Now, Sergio Aragonés is best known for his work at Mad Magazine, though. And if you see his artistic style, if you've ever read Mad Magazine since 1963, you'll recognize it. Here's a little cartoon he did pertaining to the first Star Wars movie. He was also known for his margin cartoons. In Mad Magazine, he did teeny tiny little cartoons down in the corners of the pages and up the sides of the pages that usually had nothing to do with what else was going on. That was just his own sort of individual imprimatur there on the magazine. Also from Pacific Comics, beginning 1982 by Dave Stevens, The Rocketeer. And as you can see, they're doing something by Steve Ditko as well. But The Rocketeer was an homage to the Golden Age. It was an homage to not just Golden Age superheroes, but also that same time period and the movie serials and adventure heroes in the movie serials. So it was set in the 1940s, and it had a 1940s look and a 1940s feel. And almost a decade later, it was made into a movie in 1991, and it did okay. A lot of people saw that movie and assumed, believed that this character had actually been around since the 1940s, which was not true, but that's how convincing it was.